My name is Father Roger Landry. I'm a newspaper editor and a pastor in the Diocese of Fall River, Massachusetts. Today, in the 7th installment of our 13-part series on the practical wisdom of the patron saint of priests, St. John Vianney, for every Catholic, we're going to talk about one of the most challenging things in the Christian life: how to deal with opposition, criticism, and difficulties, not just from the bad, but from the good. The more we pursue holiness, the greater criticism we'll receive. We see in the life of Jesus that even if we're holiness itself, we will suffer opposition. He told us if they hated Him, they will hate us. If they mistreated Him, they will mistreat us. If Jesus Himself were repeatedly criticized and calumniated, if all the prophets suffered disdain and rejection, and even if Blessed Mother Teresa's charity toward the poorest of the poor in our own day was attacked, there's no way we'll be spared. But no matter how great our preparation might be, when the criticism begins, it's always jarring. With regard to this, St. John Vianney has much to teach us all. He was the subject of enormous criticism and even outright opposition at his parish, among his brother priests, even in his own rectory. His reaction to these contradictions constitutes a primer for us on how to respond to the conflicts, criticisms, and even calumny we face in a Christian way. Let's begin by focusing on the criticism and opposition he encountered just by doing his priestly work in his parish. In his first several years in ours, St. John Vianney received an incredible barrage of opposition and criticism. Some of the antagonism he received came from the anti-clericalist free thinkers, but most of it came from those Catholics who really didn't want a holy pastor. Those walking in darkness abhorred the light he was radiating and began to act toward him as the Book of Wisdom had predicted more than 2,400 years earlier. Let us beset the just one, because he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doing, reproaches us for our transgressions of the law, and charges us with violations of our training. To us, he is the censure of our thoughts. Merely to see him is a hardship for us, because his life is not like others, and his ways are different. Among his biggest critics were the patrons of the taverns, the partisans of the raunchy dances called the vogues, and those who were not able to receive absolution because they refused to give up the occasions of their sins. Since he was a faithful priest, he also became a proxy punching bag for all those who had a problem with any Catholic teaching or practice. The opprobrium began with insults. They began to call him names, which like ingrate, which refers to someone disagreeable or wearisome. Others vilified him to his face. One man came to the rectory and bombarded him with vile insults for 15 minutes. St. John Vianney listened patiently without responding. When the man had finished, the saint accompanied him to the door and embraced him. Immediately after bidding him adieu, however, his flesh gave evidence of just how much his forbearance had cost him. His entire body began to break out with pimples. He used to say that he had a temper as quick as gunpowder, and it was nothing short of heroic self-restraint for him to take so many abuses and respond with love. For 18 months, another man used to stand outside the rectory each night and excoriate Vianney for as long as his voice could shout. To such detractors, Vianney would occasionally respond, "Mon ami, you know me very well." This was more than a means to disarm them. The saint knew that even if the particular things for which they were faulting him were totally unfounded, there was so much more for which he could be faulted that his deprecators didn't know. Normally, however, his strategy was to remain silent, as Christ did before the Sanhedrin. He once confided to a priest friend who himself was experiencing similar opposition, "Do as I did. I let them say all they wish, and in this way they end up holding their tongues at the last." When verbal insults failed to get him to leave ours, or at least to stop his crusade to convert the populace, Vianney's denigrators began to resort to violence. One day a man approached and savagely slapped him in the face. Stung, the curate took a moment to gain his composure. He then turned to the man, smiled, and said, "My friend, the other cheek is jealous." Most difficult to endure were the calumny and character assassination. Some young men, disappointed that their former dance partners had been converted by the priest, began to spread rumors that the reason behind his emaciation and pallor was because he had a sexually transmitted disease caught through a hidden life of sordid debauchery. As ludicrous as the accusation was, they thought that if they repeated it enough, it would eventually stick. They composed beer songs mocking him for these supposed sins, plastered posters around town and even on the rectory door labeling him a pervert, and wrote anonymous letters to the bishop accusing him of almost every degeneracy possible. When a young woman living in a house close to the rectory became pregnant, these young men started the rumor that the pastor himself was the father. His front door was repeatedly slashed with filth, and many of the people of the village began to treat him as a guilty hypocrite. His new bishop, having received so many anonymous letters and not knowing the Curé well at the time, felt obliged to send a priest to investigate the charges. The allegations were unsurprisingly determined to be total fabrications. St. John Vianney's response to all of this suffering was to abandon himself into God's hand. He didn't care in particular that his own good name was being besmirched. If God didn't need his reputation, he thought to himself, why did he think he needed it? But he was at the same time sickened by the attacks on the honor of the priesthood. In a weak moment, he considered leaving Ars for the spiritual health of his people who were being scandalized, until he was convinced that by doing so he would give plausibility to the notorious rumors. The mayor, who knew him to be innocent, pressed him to make a defense and expose the slanderers. He knew who they were. Vianney responded rather, "We must pray for them." Just like Christ, he forgave his accusers and never revealed their names, even though he was experiencing such incredible difficulties. And when one of his calumniators hit hard times, Vianney brought the family money. Eventually, the force of the evidence of his holiness and confidence in God began to bring sanity and truth back to Ars. Toward the end of his life, he summed up all that he had suffered, admitting, "If on my arrival at Ars I had foreseen all that I was to suffer there, I should have died on the spot." He confessed that he had expected that eventually a time would come when people would rout him out of Ars with sticks, when the bishop would suspend him and he would end his days in prison. As hard as it was, however, he counted all of these sufferings a grace. He converted the pain into prayer. "Never have I been so happy," he divulged at the end of his life, "as in moments when I was being persecuted and calumniated. At such times, God would flood me with consolation. God granted me at those times everything I asked him." Jesus taught us that it's easy to love those who love us. What distinguishes his true followers, however, is that we love even our enemies and pray for our persecutors. In the way he dealt with his critics, St. John Vianney proved himself to be a Christian, not just in name, but in fact. But this criticism from his parishioners and those in Ars was only the beginning. What was much worse was the criticism he received from his brother priests. And I'd like to begin this section with a story. When I was a seminarian, a priest I knew was taking me out to dinner. On the way to the restaurant, we passed a church whose territory bordered the parish where he was pastor. Since there was no sign on the property and I had never seen that church before, I asked him what the church was called. He told me what its name was and then added, "There are some bad developments happening there." I braced myself for the worst as I asked him, "What's going on?" In his response, I never forgot. Mournfully, he said, "A holy priest has moved in." In my ecclesiastical naivete, I queried why that was a bad development. And he said, "The worst thing for a pastor is when a holy priest moves next door, because everyone starts comparing you to him and they begin changing their expectations for you." This particular priest's attitude toward a holy colleague in his midst is by no means representative of all priestly situations, but it was an eye-opening experience for me. At least some priests, I realized, rather than rejoicing at the sanctity of a colleague, regard it as a problem or even a threat. This story from the early 1990s is useful to understand the negative reactions of so many priests in 19th century France to St. John Vianney. Many of the Coriovar's priest brothers didn't want a holy colleague. The opposition began with Father Trippier, the cleric who was appointed pastor in Écoli after the death of Father Vianney's mentor, friend, and first pastor, Father Charles Ballet. When Father Trippier arrived, he found the rectory more like an austere monastery than a place of priestly comfort. Even though the people loved their parochial vicar, Father Trippier thought that Father Vianney, in his tattered and patched cassock, unpolished shoes, and drooping hat, was disgracefully attired for a priest, especially one near Lyon, where priests were famous for their external deportment. He was upset that Father Vianney didn't share his interest in good food and drink, preferring to fast or to eat the smallest portions possible. He was particularly perturbed that the curate didn't share his practical pastoral priority to give preferential care to the well-to-do families of the parish. All of these offenses led Father Trippier to conclude that there was something wrong with the future patron saint of priests, that he was too rigid and eccentric, and he asked for him to be transferred. After he had been appointed to Ars, many of the priests from the surrounding districts echoed Father Trippier's censures. The well-dressed clergy thought that he was vested more like a beggar than a priest. Some teased him about it. Others criticized him and even judged him, claiming that he dressed shabbily in order to attract attention by pretending to be humble and holy. One priest refused to remain near him until he put on a better hat. Another denounced him in his presence to the bishop for not wearing a sash on his cassock. His eccentricity was confirmed, the priest asserted, when on a parish mission they bought him a pair of warm velvet trousers to wear under his thin cassock on his long wintry walk home. Along the way he met a shivering beggar and exchanged his warm pants for the beggar's cold old one. Such actions, which were somewhat routine for him, elicited derision and disapproval from his brother priests rather than admiration for his charity and selflessness. Things got worse once the lay faithful from throughout the region during parish missions started going to confession preferentially to Father Vianney, and especially when they started to make pilgrimages to Ars to confess him there. Many of his brother priests, at least a few blinded by envy, deemed such choices by the lay people spiritually dangerous. The Curé of Ars, after all, had spent only 5 months total in seminary. He had been dismissed from it for being an exceptionally poor student and still barely knew Latin. The situation was aggravated when some mentally unstable people returned from Ars proclaiming that Father Vianney was a better priest than they were, and often inventing words to put into the Curé of Ars' mouth to justify their foolish behavior. One pastor received a stipend from a lady to pray for a special intention at Mass, only to discover later that the special intention was that he be removed and Father Vianney take his place. That didn't help to endear Father Vianney to his brothers. Several of the surrounding pastors, alarmed that the people were esteeming a colleague whom they believed too simple-minded, began to take action. Many forbade their parishioners to go to Ars at all. Others wrote to the bishop. Several others used their Sunday sermons to preach not about the good news, but about the Curé of Ars. Father Vianney got wind of what his colleagues were doing, and it wounded him, as silly as it was. Poor little Curé of Ars, he said. What do they not make him say? What do they not make him do? They are now preaching on him and no longer preaching on the gospel, he said. He started to receive hate mail from his brother priests. One of the more famous examples came from Father Jean-Louis Bourgeon, a newly ordained priest in a village 5 miles from Ars. Jealous that so many of his parishioners were going to Ars to confession, Father Bourgeon denounced him from the pulpit. He then wrote his neighbor, charging, among other things, when a man knows as little theology as you, he shouldn't even dare go into the confessional, he told St. John Vianney. Father Vianney was grieved and wondered whether God might indeed be offended by his service in Ars. He wrote the young priest back in words that touched the young priest. Most dear and most venerated confrere, what good reason I have for loving you. You are the only person who really knows me. Since you are so good and kind as to take an interest in my poor soul, do help me to obtain the favor for which I've been asking for such a long time, that being released from a post which I am not worthy to hold by reason of my ignorance, I may be allowed to retire into a little corner there to weep over my poor life. Father Vianney's sincerity and humility deeply moved Father Bourgeon, who, pierced with compunction, ran to Ars to beg Father Vianney's forgiveness. Vianney warmly embraced him, and thereafter the young priest became one of the Curia of Ars' greatest supporters. The priests of the region eventually composed a circular petition calling on the bishop to remove Father Vianney because of his supposed ignorance. By accident, the petition was sent to Ars. Father Vianney read it, saw the names and denunciations. His response was to sign his own name to it and send it off to the bishop, hoping that the bishop would react by sending someone more capable to Ars. The prelate, however, seeing Vianney's signature and marveling at his humility, decided as a means by which to justify Father Vianney in the eyes of his colleagues, to send a canon of the cathedral to examine the situation. During the visitation, Father Vianney submitted a list of 200 difficult cases of conscience he had confronted, along with his solutions. The prelate found the solutions unfailingly correct. And after the examination, when priests continued to call Vianney mad, the bishop routinely replied, "Gentlemen, I wish that all my priests had a small grain of the same madness." The bishop granted him faculties rare at the time to hear confessions anywhere throughout the diocese. With time, the bishop's support and admiration began to be emulated by most of the presbyterate. The greatest redemption of St. John Vianney's reputation among his brother priests occurred in subsequent clergy convocations, where even though he was listed as one of many official confessors, most of his brother priests chose to confess to him. They began to see, in short, that having a holy priest as a neighbor is not a bad development at all, but a grace for faithful and priests alike. After a short break, we'll talk about the worst opposition that St. John Vianney had to endure. As excruciating as these first two sources of antagonism were, opposition in the parish and opposition among the brother priests in the presbyterate of the diocese, they paled to an even more difficult test that occurred much closer to home. It occurred, in fact, in the home, in the rectory, at the hands of his priest assistant, Father Antoine Raymond. One of the most seldom discussed challenges of priestly life is what modern church sociologists call rectory living. The fact that a bishop assigns 2 or more men to live and work together doesn't mean that they will cohabitate and collaborate easily. There are, of course, rectory situations, like St. John Vianney experienced with his first pastor, friend, and mentor, Father Charles Ballet, in which the pastor and curate become true friends who inspire each other to become better and holier priests. There are many more in which the priests get along just fine and treat each other with professional respect and genuine fraternity. There are some occasions, however, in which living and working together can become a crucifixion for one or both. A recent in-depth study by Georgetown's Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, examining why some young priests abandon the priesthood, showed that one of the chief reasons is because they can't get along with their pastor. It's hard enough to work for a boss with whom one doesn't see eye to eye. It's doubly difficult to live with him. Rectory tensions often lead young priests to seek outlets, and some of these outlets are not conducive to priestly perseverance. On the flip side, there are many pastors who admit that as exhausting as it is to be the only priest in a parish, they prefer to live and work alone rather than to have a curate assigned to them who might be a pastoral and personal cross. Some priests provide more harm than help. That's what happened for Father Vianney when his first assistant arrived. For his first 27 years in Ars, Father Vianney was the only priest there. After recovering from a serious illness, he asked the bishop for 2 weeks off to travel to his native Dardilly to rest with his brother and his family. The bishop granted his permission, provided that he was able to find what we'd call coverage, somebody to cover the masses. That task proved much easier than anticipated, because Father Antoine Raymond, a young pastor in Savigny, volunteered. Father Vianney had known Antoine Raymond from the time he was in high school seminary and generously volunteered to pay the young man's college and major seminary costs. Visiting Ars and seeing the throngs of pilgrims coming to confession, the future Father Raymond began to dream one day of becoming the curé of Ars himself. He must have believed that people were coming to Ars for some other reason than Father Vianney. When Father Vianney was planning to make his home visit, Father Raymond jumped at the chance to offer himself to the bishop as his successor. The bishop declined, but accepted the young priest's offer to cover for Father Vianney while he was away. When the Holy Curé returned, he discovered that Father Raymond had actually taken up quasi-permanent residence in Ars, despite remaining pastor in Savigny. Father Vianney soon recognized the obvious, that the young priest longed to remain in Ars, since he had paid for a seminary education and therefore felt a responsibility for him. And since it was obvious that he could benefit from having another priest in Ars to help out with the daily pilgrimages, he wrote the bishop asking that Father Raymond be assigned with him. At the diocesan headquarters, this request was well received. The bishop and his chief collaborators knew that Father Vianney didn't have the time or the skill set to give adequate attention to administration. He also had developed a reputation of giving all, not only to those who truly needed them, but also to those who were routinely taking advantage of his goodness. They figured Father Raymond, who was a capable organizer and a zealous teacher, would be able to bring some order to Ars. The bishop assigned him as a curate, but gave him some authority to look over the books and administrative affairs. He took that inch and stretched it into a marathon. As soon as Father Raymond received his letters, he went to the rectory and said that he wished to take the room where the curé had slept for the previous nearly 3 decades. The curé was diligently moving his few things down to a damp room on the first floor before the parishioners got wind of it and came to stop it. Father Raymond began to identify himself as the pastor or curé to parishioners and in the church registers where he would do baptism. He started almost immediately changing parish customs that had long been established. He was brazen, peremptory, arrogant, and some parishioners said even a little tyrannical. What bothered the people of Ars the most was how disrespectful he was to their pastor. Within a few weeks, the leading parishioners couldn't take it anymore and went to see the bishop. His administrative duties were removed. But for the next 8 years, as Father Vianney's assistant, Father Raymond routinely berated the great confessor in private and in public. He badmouthed him to parishioners and pilgrims. He occasionally contradicted him from the pulpit and declared everywhere that Father Vianney was entering his second childhood. He even tried to take credit for all the good that was happening in Ars. Father Vianney tolerated it all with great patience. At first he tried to assert himself, but learned that that only made Father Raymond more belligerent. From that point forward, he resolved to keep him informed, to consult him, and to give in to him as much as possible. He saw Father Raymond as the antidote to all the praise he got from the crowds. He said, "While some people incense me, there are also quite a few kicks." Talking about Father Raymond, he said, "He's not afraid to tell me the truth about myself. Without him, it would have been difficult for me to know that I loved the good Lord a little." He judged his love for God on how much he was able to love Father Raymond. He routinely defended him when others were justly criticizing the curate's behavior. One Holy Week, when Father Raymond's behavior was particularly obnoxious, the saint was persuaded to dictate a letter to the bishop asking for him to be transferred. After reviewing the letter, however, Father Vianney decided to tear it up, saying, "The good God carried his cross this Holy Week. I certainly can carry my own." It was Father Raymond who, anticipating that he would likely never succeed the Curé of Ars, who finally asked for a transfer. The bishop appointed him pastor someplace else, and a missionary priest, Father Tocanier, took his place. It was, in a sense, an earthly recompense for the Curé of Ars. Father Tocanier loved and revered the pastor, took care of him, and inspired him to continue giving heroically until the finish line of his life. God always brings good out of evil, and he used Father Raymond's vices to help sculpt Father Vianney into an even greater saint. In conclusion, in the face of the inevitable contradictions all of us confront in life, St. John Vianney is a model of how to respond in a holy way. It would have been easy for him, for the old Adam in him, the one with a temper he said as quick as gunpowder, to explode and put people in their places with vigor. But he sought to identify himself with the great high priest, Jesus himself, who, although sometimes when the situation merited it, used choice words to attack the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees, and used a whip to expel the money changers who were turning his father's house into a den of thieves, for the most part responded by praying for his persecutors and loving those who had made themselves his enemies. In this, St. John Vianney shows us the most beautiful face of the Christian, and yet another glimpse of how he demonstrated the love of the heart of Jesus in his priesthood. In short, he lived the 8th Beatitude. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. St. John Vianney's reward in heaven is indeed great. And if we follow him in converting the opposition we face into occasions of prayer and forgiveness, so will ours. See you next time.